Good morning, everybody. Bom dia. So we are back for the second day of our international dialogue and conference on the many phases and facets of federalism. We are a bit behind schedule, but this should not be worrying us. We will manage with that. First of all, I will read out the disclaimer. So, all statements expressed by the Fundação Getulio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily the Foundation's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on the Foundation's official channels. To continue with this transmission, we ask that you express your agreement by verbalizing or signaling your agreement. So this is done. Now we can move on to the first session, and it is my great pleasure, without further ado, to actually pass the word to Zemelak Ayele. He's an expert professor in Ethiopia, and he should be online, I was told, and everything should work now. So, welcome, Zemelak. It's really great to have you in this room. Unfortunately, only online. We hope that next time it will be possible to have you also in person within this group for this further dialogue across continents, disciplines, and subdisciplines. So, Zemelak, I guess you're ready to start now. Then I immediately hand over to you, and I thank you on behalf of us all for your input on federalism, decentralization, and territorial responses to diversity in Africa. A huge topic that you really nicely will do in 30 minutes or so. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your kind introduction.
Zemelak, maybe you can make the screen big if you manage.
Yes.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm also sorry that I couldn't be there and meet all those interesting people at the conference. I'm sad about that. Anyways, still technology has allowed us to meet across oceans, and I'm grateful for that. I'm also thankful for the organizers for inviting me to speak at this conference, especially I should say thank you to Eduardo, Elizabeth, and Johanna. As you can see from the title of my presentation, I'll speak about federalism, especially the territorial response through federal arrangement to diversity in Africa. The outline of my presentation would look like this. First, I will speak about factors that underpin demands for federal or devolved system in Africa, because there is a huge demand for this kind of arrangement. And then I will talk about the two territorial approaches that different federal systems in Africa have adopted in terms of responding to diversity. I will speak about that based on the federal experience of three countries: Kenya, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And I will also speak about the implications of this arrangement. Now, just to give you a background or the context, Africa is a very diverse continent. It has about 1,200 ethnic communities, and these ethnic communities have thousands of clans and tribes. So diversity is a feature of the African continent. But in this diversity, we have about 50 plus countries in Africa, which basically means every African country is diverse, plus the territories of the boundaries of African countries were demarcated by colonial powers. So the demarcation of boundaries were haphazard. They didn't care about putting people of the same culture and ethnic background in the same country. So many communities are divided into different countries. When the African countries became independent in the 1960s, they had to create a state, a functioning state, and the leaders were of the opinion that they have to do away with any kind of diversity and build a nation state along the culture, institutions, and language of the colonizing powers. So that was the attempt. To that effect, they instituted unitary system, centralized system. They instituted imperial presidency, and in many cases, one-party system. Despite the attempt to create a nation state, of course, politics in Africa was usually based on ethnicity. One would come to power or would be removed from power because of his or her ethnic affiliation. Democracy was non-existent, and military coups were very frequent in Africa. So this was basically the context that we had between 1960s and until 1990s. In the 1990s, there was a push for democratization, and as part of that push for democratization, there was also a demand for devolved or decentralized system or some kind of federal arrangement. So starting from the early 1990s, several African countries adopted some kind of federal arrangement or devolved arrangement, including South Africa, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Sudan, Congo, Kenya, South Sudan, Somalia, and Zimbabwe. There are also other countries in the process of revising their constitution to devolve power to their subnational units. Now, in terms of dealing with diversity through territorial arrangement, like I said earlier, there were basically two approaches. The first is exclusively based on ethnic settlement pattern. The other one was ethnicity plus other factors approach, geographic, economic, administrative, and other factors also included. Now, the two important federal or devolved countries in Africa, Kenya and Nigeria, at independence, they tried the first approach, the exclusively ethnic-based approach, but it didn't work, as I would explain later. It didn't work for them, so they abandoned this approach. But Ethiopia, after 40 years after this approach was tested and failed, it adopted the same approach now, and it is struggling with this kind of system that it has adopted. Now, let me speak a bit about each country. Kenya achieved its independence in the 1960s, and when the independence of the country was being negotiated with the colonial administration of Britain, there were two political parties who were involved in the negotiation. One was KANU, or the Kenyan African National Union. The other was KADU, or Kenyan African Democratic Union. The first political party, which was made up of representatives of the major ethnic communities like Kikuyu and Luo, they wanted independence immediately, and they wanted also to establish a unitary and centralized system in Kenya. On the other hand, KADU, which was composed of smaller ethnic communities, which were afraid of being dominated by the larger ethnic communities once Kenya became independent, they advocated for a federal arrangement, whose subnational territorial arrangement is based on ethnicity. Of course, the colonial administration agreed with the latter party, and they introduced what is called Majimboism. It is a Swahili. Majimbo is a Swahili word which means region, and about 8 provinces or regions were created based on ethnicity, purely based on ethnic arrangements. The map of Kenya at independence looked like this. So there were large ethnically organized regional or provinces in Kenya. But this arrangement created a lot of problems. First thing, it heightened inter-ethnic rivalry because politics already was based on ethnicity. Now, when it found geographical expression, the inter-ethnic rivalry and animosity basically increased. And there were inter-ethnic conflict. So despite KADU, I mean, the party which is organized by smaller ethnic communities, succeeding in achieving in achieving a constitution which introduced ethnic-based federal system, the party which came to power was KANU, which was composed of the large ethnic communities, taking the inter-ethnic community, the inter-ethnic violence as an excuse. The party in power basically abolished this system and introduced a very centralized system. And the centralized system continued to be in place for about 4 decades until the early 2000. Now, in the early 2000s, there was a demand for democratization because the country was under one-party system, under authoritarian leadership of Daniel Arap Moi. So there was a push for democratization. As part of this push for democratization, there was also a demand for devolution. Now, when it comes to devolution, the issue was whether to go back to the Majimbo system, which is based on ethnicity, or to create a new kind of devolved system. So it was clear that the Majimbo system was not to be favored because it heightened inter-ethnic rivalry. So it was decided there should be a devolved system, but the subnational units should not be organized purely based on ethnicity. Rather, other factors should be also taken into account. So they created 47 counties, which are smaller than the provinces of the 1960s, which also divided the major ethnic communities into different counties. Now, the largest ethnic communities like the Kikuyu and Luo are divided into up to 10 counties. Some are divided into 9 counties. The smaller communities also had their own counties. Basically, there is not, except Nairobi, every county has an ethnic community which is in a majority in that county. And the arrangement responds to the self-administration or the self-rule demand of more or less most of the ethnic communities of the country. So the map now looks like this: much smaller counties, much smaller subnational units, but none of the ethnic communities are enclosed into a single province, as was the case in the 1960s. What is the implication of this arrangement? Of course, it has provided a political space for the inclusion of smaller ethnic communities. It has increased access to social services, as most decentralized systems do. It has also reduced the incidence of political violence, as many reports indicate. But it didn't do away with ethnicity in Kenya. Still, ethnicity is very important in Kenyan politics. The presidency is still the most important political positions, and people fight for the position along ethnic line. There are ethnic alliances to get to the presidency. Even after one alliance makes it to the state house, the other one would make things difficult, as now it's happening in Kenya. There are demonstrations, there are protesters against the president recently elected. Now let me go to Nigeria. Nigeria is, I think, the oldest federal country in Africa. Its journey towards federal system began when it was still under the colony of Britain. It started its federal arrangement using 3 regions as subnational units. These 3 regions were the North, the West, and the East, as you can see in the map here. In the North are the Hausa Fulani ethnic communities, who are largely Muslims. In the West are the Yoruba, and in the East are the Igbo ethnic communities. Of course, in Nigeria, there are many other communities, over 300, if I'm not wrong, ethnic communities are found in Nigeria, but the 3 are the dominant ethnic communities in the country. So when the federal system of the country was established, it was these big regions, which were demarcated again along ethnic line, were used as subnational units. Now, as you can imagine, the federal system was fairly unbalanced because the northern region was bigger than the 2 southern regions combined. It represents about 60 or 70% of the total territorial area of Nigeria. So there was clearly imbalance. There was also imbalance in terms of distribution of economic and social services. The southern was more favored in that regard, and the north was poor and sparsely populated. In any case, after the federal system was established, the federal system was undermined by the imbalance of the federal system, because the northern region was basically rivaling with the central government. The central government, which had a parliamentary form of government, was very weak to contend with these regional powers. Plus, according to the constitutional division, more power was given to the regions, and the center was, even in terms of power, very, very weak. There was also this competition among the regional powers to control the center. All these factors undermined the functioning of the federal system. So something had to be done. Nigeria became independent in 1960 immediately because the republic dysfunctioned. In 1963, there was a military coup d'etat. And no, not in 1963, I think it was in 1966. From 1966 until 1999, Nigeria was basically under military rule. The military government, those who were in power in the military government, had a centrist mindset, and they wanted to do away with the federal arrangement as existed in the 1960s. And one military president after the other introduced several reforms, which resulted in the division of these 3 regions. So in 1990, the country was, and the regions were divided several times. By 1979, there were about 19 states after these regions were divided. In 1989, there were 21 states. In 1995, about 30. And in 1999, when the current constitution was adopted, the number of states increased to 36. Now, the existing 36 states, almost all of them have ethnic majority, but the major ethnic communities are, as you can imagine, divided into so many states. This has lessened the pressure from the center, because there is no big large region contending or competing with the central government. The states have become smaller, also in terms of power became weaker. So the center was relieved of this regional pressure. The system also created intra-ethnic community rivalry. Now, communities or those who are from the same community but living in neighboring states now started to compete against each other for resources that they can get from the center. So this allowed the center to be stronger and took off the pressure coming from the ethnically organized region. In this way, it has kind of resolved the problem, but at the same time, regional identity did not go away. Still, regional identities are important. Presidential elections are conducted, for example, on rotation. One presidential candidate has to come from the north, another one, the subsequent one has to come from the south. Still, in terms of representation in the civil administration, in the military, and in every federal institution, ethnicity is very important. They have even what is called the Federal Character Commission, which checks that every federal institution is composed of different ethnic communities and that it is not dominated by any particular ethnic community. Now, having said this about Nigeria, let me go to Ethiopia. Ethiopia had projected itself in the past as a nation state, Amharic-speaking, Orthodox Christian nation state, despite having over 80 ethnic communities in the country. It had tried to implement a nation state building project, which did not succeed. Rather, it led to different conflicts and 70 years of civil war, which ended in 1991, when the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front came to power. And that party introduced different reforms that led to the current federal system, which is basically ethnic-based federal system. Now, the defining features of Ethiopian federal system is that it is a system which is based on the recognition of the right to self-determination of ethnic communities. It is therefore considered to be a federation of ethnic communities, not a federation of territories. It is a potentially breakable federation because it allows ethnic communities to secede and become independent states. Within the federal system allows ethnic communities to establish their own states. So in principle, every ethnic community is entitled for a state of its own. Currently, the current states, which are now 13 in number, we started with 9, and new states have been created in the past 2 or 3 years. Still, they are multi-ethnic states, despite some of them having dominant ethnic community. But the principle is that every ethnic community, regardless of its population size, or its economic status, or whether or not it has the capacity to run a state, in principle, it is entitled to a state of its own. So based on this principle, purely based on ethnic consideration, we have created a map that looks like this. The 3 largest regions, you can see the one in blue is Oromia, which is the state of the Oromos, which constitute about 35% of the population, and it is the largest region. The one in the north of Oromia is the Amhara region. It is the second largest region in terms of population. About 25% of the population belong to this community, the Amhara. In the east, you can see the Somali. It is, in terms of territory, this is the second largest region, but it is sparsely populated. It has about the Somalis constitute only 6% of the population, and we have the Tigrayans and other communities. Now, these large regions that I mentioned have a dominant ethnic communities. So we cannot, or we do not expect these regions to shrink in terms of size, because there is no community that can secede from these regions. But the smaller ones are the ones which are ethnically heterogeneous, and they are the ones which are likely to break into smaller states. So already when it was created, it was a very unbalanced federation, and it is likely to become even more unbalanced and even more unhealthy kind of a federal system. So the center in the past was very strong because of the party in power, and now the center is facing pressure from regional powers, and it is becoming weak and facing both political and military challenges from the regions, including the Tigray war that I assume you all know. So what is the way out? Let me talk first about the results of this federal arrangement. The positive side of this federal arrangement is that it has allowed those who were communities who were up to now marginalized, both in political and cultural terms, to be included in the political and cultural life of the country. It has also the effect of localizing the conflicts, because before it was a war between armed groups and the central government. Now there are many smaller conflicts which are not necessarily against the central government. In that regard, it has localized inter-ethnic or other conflicts. The problem is it is an unhealthy federation, as I said. There is an imbalance in territorial and population terms among the regions. It did not also take into account, since it is based on purely ethnic based arrangement, it did not take into account sub-ethnic historical identities. Just because some people speak the same language, they were considered to be of the same ethnic community, and they were enclosed into one region. The other thing, the federal arrangement is based on the notion that every ethnic community should have one region, and every region should have, an ethnic community cannot have more than one region. So large ethnic community like or the Oromo are included in a single state. This is what my friend Jonathan Fsa called the original sin of the Ethiopian federal arrangement, which did not take into account subnational ethnic identity. So the impact of this arrangement is inter-ethnic animosity, inter-ethnic rivalry. Politics in the country begins and ends with ethnicity. To assume certain position in any part of the country, your ethnicity is the most important factor, nothing else. Plus, as you remember, the Tigray war, which according to some reports, over 500,000 people lost because of this war. And this war was caused one way or the other because of the federal system that Ethiopia has adopted. Now, let me go to the last point. So what is the way out? The one way out would be to renegotiate the constitutional arrangement and to redesign the federal arrangement. But it is not likely to happen, because the major ethnic communities such as the Oromos, the Tigray, the Somalis, they like this arrangement. They don't want to see it changed. Their political elites, they do not want to see any change for the arrangement that we have now. So we cannot imagine the political elites coming together and renegotiating the constitutional arrangement and devising another kind of federal arrangement. The other option will be, as was the case in Kenya and Nigeria, maybe a top-down kind of coercive kind of revision. That is another option. Some people are mulling about this kind of option. Even some authorities are discussing about centrally enforced kind of arrangement, but this will be a very risky kind of attempt to redesign the federal system, because like I said, there are segments of the society who want to maintain it, who think or believe that they have benefited from the system and they don't want the system to be changed in any ways. So any attempt to undo it would certainly lead to conflict, if not war. But my last point is, if the federal government can manage, this is my argument, I may be wrong, can manage to, using this top-down arrangement, redesign the federal system, definitely it's going to face resistance and opposition. And if it can survive the initial onslaught of opposition and resistance, and if it can actually create smaller subnational units and create political positions, and if that kind of redesigned federal arrangement could exist for 10 or 15 years, it is likely to be self-sustaining, because it will create also new identities, it will create new interests, and it will create new positions, and it will create new groups who would fight for it and who would fight for maintaining the system. But like I said, it is gambling. It may also end up in the complete disintegration of the country. Let me stop here. Thank you very much for listening to me, and obrigado.
Thank you so much, Zemelak, also for being super on time. A really, really complex cases summarized in perfectly in 30 minutes. I personally really liked the expression of ethnic mass, because ethnic mass obviously counts a lot if one actually then goes and sees how electoral laws actually define who is in power and who is not in power, and how this all works out. I will invite now, before we then go for a Q&A and discussion session, Rogerio Schlegel to come up and to give his insights. As complex as the first input, but at least it deals with one country, let's say. So that might be a bit easier in that sense.
Morning, everyone. I'll try to make the most of my time to speak of a country that is mostly mononational. We have in this session the opportunity to revise the general idea that federalism involves diversity with unity. Martha Hetty has already shown yesterday how the main territorial cleavage in the Brazilian Federation involves income and wealth. I'll briefly discuss how the notions of diversity and unity apply to Brazil, but following our colleague Zemelak Ayele, I'll concentrate on ethnicity, cultural cleavages, and territorial identities. What about starting the presentation? Good. Oh, and by the way, I'm from the Federal University of São Paulo. Okay, so my presentation, we will discuss notions of unity and diversity applied to Brazil, some historic background. I think that at this point you are ready to some Brazilian history. How we have limited diversity but not homogeneity, the prevalence of a dual territorial identity, preference for homogeneous policies among Brazilians, and the voting divide in presidential elections that is a growing phenomenon, let's say. Really? Yeah, good. My take-home message is that in Brazil, unity prevails in terms of territorial identity, but there are growing tensions. Great. You know that Daniel Elazar argued that in federations, unity and diversity should not be understood as polar opposites, but rather as congruent concepts. The opposite of unity would not be diversity, but disunity, which I understand he didn't define thoroughly, but it seems something similar to conflict. Diversity would be the opposite of homogeneity, and it would manifest through nationality or ethnic, religious, ideological, and social dimensions. So you can see here the two axes proposed by Elazar: unity, diversity, and homogeneity, diversity. Sorry, unity, disunity, and homogeneity, diversity. I'll leave aside the axis related to unity, disunity, which seems conceptually more problematic in my view, and concentrate on the other. The idea of an axis homogeneity, diversity might be useful to understand Brazilian identities. Because although the country is far from being homogeneous, its diversity doesn't express itself as different nations or regions claiming for devolution. This framework allows us to think of a country where unity of identity prevails, but there is much diversity to be taken into account. Well, now I'll pass to a brief overview of the Brazilian history and the whole of centripetal and centrifugal forces. This is a conventional periodization of the Brazilian history. In 1822, we got independent from Portugal, and we experienced a centralized monarchy. We had what we call a first republic from 1889 to 1930, basically an oligarchic regime with liberal institutions, very decentralized. Then we had the Vargas era from 1930 to 1945. It started with the 1930 revolution, led by Vargas, Getulio Vargas, and evolved to a dictatorship, the Estado Novo, the Brazilian Estado Novo. Then we had the 1946 democracy until 1964, when we had the coup d'etat by the military. This democracy was basically marked by competitive politics, much better, competitive politics and emerging mass electorate. You must be familiar with the military regime that we had between 1964 and 1985, but it's not a regime of one single leader. We had generals succeeding each other in power, and now we're experiencing and trying to defend the ongoing democratic period. We had a civilian in the presidency in 1985. And the most recent constitution is from 1988. Beware, because not few specialists in Brazil would describe this trajectory as marked by centralization and decentralization waves in a pendular fashion. For instance, after the Getulio Vargas centralizing dictatorship, the 1946 democratization would have brought about decentralization. Then another centralizing authoritarian period would have came, and so on. But this is clearly an oversimplification. As I recently argued in an article on regional and federal studies, based on the study that Paulo Dardanelli, coordinated by Paulo Dardanelli, John Kincaid, and I worked on the case of Brazil. So I prefer to think about centripetal and centrifugal forces throughout the Brazilian history, particularly the Republican history. As centripetal forces, I would mention territorial unity as a central value for political elites since the monarchy, since we were an empire in Brazilian terms. I would mention developmentalism, the faith in state-led economic development, which has informed the action of governments regardless of regime, from 1930 to at least the 1970s. Centralized welfare policies. Getulio Vargas started a set of welfare policies that were marked by, that was launched by the central government. And this kind of policy, this path dependence, if I may say, marked the Brazilian history of social policies until the recent constitution in 1988. And I would also mention the role of the military. They championed for centralization throughout the 20th century, and they were quite influential in our history, recent history. As centrifugal forces, I would mention the accommodation of interests in the outset of the Republic. Actually, when we became a republic, we adopted federalism to accommodate different interests as different as those of the South and the Southeast. Politicians, elites from the South and Southeast would prefer an ultra-federalist model. We had to accommodate the interests of the Northeastern elites that were highly marked by the recent end of the slavery, and also the military. So the military was the central actors to start the republic. I should also mention as centrifugal force the fragmentation of the party system. To begin with, in the first republic, we had one dominant party in each state and no nationalized party. This marked profoundly our party life. And even nowadays, we don't have, we have many parties that has the ambition to be national, but in fact are federations of regional interests. Lula's party, I'd say, is an exception in this case, but we can discuss later on. And I would also mention as centrifugal force the association of democracy and decentralization at the end of the military regime. In the 80s, in the 1980s, political and societal actors understand that bringing back democracy depended on bringing back federalism and a more decentralized way of developing public policies. Less clear is the whole of the historically pronounced territorial inequalities in terms of wealth, population, and political power. Clear in terms of being pro-centralization or pro-decentralization. Historically, the country is marked by dramatic territorial asymmetries, with wealth and population concentrated in the South, as Marta showed us yesterday. The South and the Southeast, this is the federal district where Brasilia is located. I would add a layer to what Marta said yesterday. This asymmetry and the emergence of the Center-West, this region here, is happening mainly because of economic development. We discussed that yesterday, very briefly. The agribusiness, meaning extensive agriculture and livestock for export, has tripled in revenues in the last 3 years, and is close to the Argentinian GDP in revenues. We have something like $500 million coming from the agribusiness as revenues, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Argentinian GDP is close to $600 billion. But political and social elites from poorer and less influential states have repeatedly joined pro-centralization coalitions as a form of counterbalancing the richer state's power and accessing more resources from the center. This led to an enduring feature of the electoral system, for instance. São Paulo and other economically dynamic states have been underrepresented in the lower chamber of Congress since the Electoral Code of 1932. This kind of malapportionment survived 2 transitions to democracy. We still have this today. And redistributive issues are always a hot topic in constitutional assemblies, and we had many of them. And institutional reforms, we are undergoing one of these tax reforms these days. Coming back to ethnic asymmetries, on the left side we have a map on the distribution of black and browns, as we used to say, pretos e pardos in Brazil. We can see that there's a concentration in the northeast and north, but they are distributed throughout the country. This map refers, okay, no, I cannot point and look at the same time. This map refers to the indigenous peoples' distribution throughout the country. So they are concentrated in the coast, but mainly in the Amazon. Most of them, more than 50% of indigenous peoples are concentrated in the legal Amazon area around here. Actually, the country is fundamentally mononational and have a dominant group espousing the national identity, but it contains considerable cultural diversity due to colonization, slavery, and immigration. Basically, immigration from Europe and Japan. If you go to Liberdade, a neighborhood in São Paulo, you have a sample of the Japanese immigration. Indigenous peoples represent less than 1% of the population, and as I said, they are concentrated in the north. Does it generate tensions within the federation, with cleavages or conflicts along territorial lines or devolution claims? The short answer is no. Sorry. My short answer is no. There is a growing feeling of attachment among those that belong to these groups. The group that identifies themselves as Black increased 32% in 10 years. People are increasingly, the population is not changing, but the self-consciousness is changing. People are increasingly declaring themselves as Black or brown. And as you can see in the map, the proportion is of blacks and browns are higher in the north and northeast. Regarding indigenous peoples, last national election saw the record of candidates self-declared indigenous running for the House of Representatives, our Câmara dos Deputados. They were 84 in 2014, 134 in 2018, and 175 in 2022. 5 of them got elected last year. It was a record. the previous mandate, we had just one indigenous, one original indigenous people, one candidate coming from the indigenous peoples elected in 1218. We have like 500 representatives. So as they represent less than 1% in the population, they are almost 1% of the representative in the lower chamber. But 4 out of 5 elected representatives came from the southeastern states, not from the north. So, I don't know, people from other ethnicities are voting for indigenous candidates. But the salience of the issues related to traditional populations and environmental protection is also expressed by the fact that the third Lula administration, inaugurated 6 months ago, created the first ever Ministry for Indigenous People in response to the wave of violence and land invasions stimulated by Bolsonaro's dismantling of indigenous protections in the previous administration. This has to do with climate emergency. The demarcation of indigenous reserves is an obstacle to the expansion of agribusiness and mining in the north of the country. Okay, this figure represents an study about our territorial identity. Marta Hetty, Diogo Ferrari from the University of California in Riverside, and I conducted 2 waves of surveys on federative issues. And one of the results was precisely this one. None of the tensions or none of the asymmetries regarding ethnicities seem to have unsettled the usual majoritarian convergence of the Brazilian population around a national territorial identity. This is the response to the Lins Moreno question. We asked the respondents, do you feel more Brazilian or Paulista? For instance, for those that live in São Paulo, in the state of São Paulo. We also ask, do you feel as Paulista as Brazilian? Or do you feel more Paulista than Brazilian? And this is the results. We have here more than 45% of people saying they feel as Brazilian as Paulista or Pernambucano or Fluminense, those from Rio de Janeiro, in 2013 and in 2018. This is the attachment related to the state, identidade estadual, the regional identity, much less pronounced, and this is the national-only identity. Those that responded, I feel brasileiro, I feel Brazilian, but not Paulista. Just to have a hint of what this may mean, in 2016, Catalans showed 33% of dual identity and 58% of regional identity. And in the beginning of the 2010s, 34 of the English revealed dual identity, 34, against 40 that declared themselves English but not British. So you see that our dual identity is quite pronounced. But we can see that the attachment to the states grew between the 2013 and 2018. The dark brown bars and the the dark blue bars and the light blue bars. There's something here. There's something there. We had Brazil in general experienced a civil turmoil, a political turmoil between these two time points. We have massive street demonstrations in 1213. We have the largest ever investigation of corruption among politicians, the so-called car wash operation. We have the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff in 2016. We have the inauguration of the former vice president, or the previously vice president, Michel Temer, and the following U-turn in different aspects of public policies and macroeconomic policy, and kind of a crisis of confidence, I'd say. Even this crisis of confidence brought about this wasn't enough to close the gap between those two kinds of regional identity, of territorial identity. Okay. It's also worth mentioning that in multivariate regression models that we run, territorial identity didn't seem to explain preference for redistribution. So we clearly tend to a mononational country in terms of attitudes. That's my bottom line at this part. And this might be reflected in the institutional design. And now we are discussing responsiveness of the system vis-a-vis our territorial identities. Apparently, in line with this territorial identity, we found in our surveys that in general, Brazilians consider national decisions to be the most important. This bar here, over 50%. With the subnational government's decisions lagging far behind. This is state decisions, and this is local government decisions. They also think that the most important decisions are taken at the central level. Over 6% responded so. And you see, the local government is even considered more, with decisions more important than the state governments. And we also, sorry. Yeah, respondents also assess national elections. No, sorry. Thank you. Thank you, myself. At the same time, most Brazilians want homogeneous policies throughout the territory. This figure shows this. So when we ask them, would you prefer national policies to give cash transfers to poor people? More than 6% says yes. We want it to be homogeneous throughout the territory. And this is the percentage points increase when we talk about tackling unemployment, unemployment insurance, promoting education, taking care of the elderly, promoting health, fixing the minimum wage, and fixing the pensions values. 3/4 want homogeneous policies in this case. So the institutional framework and the design of our public policies seem to be in line with these preferences, with the public preferences, at least at face value. Brazilium seems to support the cooperative way the federation works in many policy areas, with legislative authority over most policies concentrated in the center, as we discussed yesterday. No, I don't have time to show this. I will be very quickly here. We can go more with more care. We can come back to this later, but some of you may be familiar with with this project, Why Decentralization in Federations, the project that I mentioned with Alan Fenner participated in another phase. We have Kincaid and Dardanelli coordinating the second phase with Juan Olmeda, is one of the participants. And briefly, this figure tries to represent the mini score for 22 policy areas throughout the Brazilian Republican history. And one here means that the competences are exclusive to the central, hold exclusively by the central government. And 7 means that they are exclusively held by state governments. So the score 4 would represent an equilibrium, equally shared competences. We can see that in the case of Brazil, we are, throughout the Brazilian history, we are under the score 4. But I'll discuss this later on. I'll concentrate on my final topic regarding a probable novelty that we are facing these days, nowadays. We've seen how the territorial identity has oscillated towards a more regional identity. The territorial distribution of the votes in presidential elections is another way to express this, let's say, possibility of change, because it's pointing to potential changes regarding diversity in the Brazilian Federation. Since 2006, we've experienced a geographical divide in terms of votes, for president. You see these maps? This is the presidential election in 1989, 1994, 2002. We have different candidates, but in general, we have, although the proportions would change, we have the winner with a majority of votes in almost every state. From 2006 on, this kind of cleavage changed. And we can see here that we have Lula against the PSDB candidate Alckmin running, Dilma, another candidate from the Workers' Party, running against Serra from the same party of Alckmin, PSDB. And this is the 2018 election with Bolsonaro, who won, running against Haddad from the Workers' Party. And this is 2022, Lula against Bolsonaro. We can see there's an emerging pattern here, with more conservative forces winning in the South and the Center-West, and Lula and the Workers' Party winning in the Northeast. Sorry. I think that a promising hypothesis to explain this trend is that the beginning of the differentiation between voters of the North and the South was generated by 30 minutes, thanks. A differentiation generated by a compositional effect. Once in power, Lula and the Workers' Party developed policies that particularly favored low-income citizens. As they weren't homogeneously distributed throughout the country, we had this kind of effect. The votes for the Workers' Party intensified in the Northeast and in the North, and perhaps this is becoming a stable pattern. Some examples of this possibility. In 2018, the Workers' Party elected 4 governors and 5 allies in the northeastern states. In 2022, the party elected 4 governors again and 4 allies among northeastern governors. During the pandemic, governors of the Northeast created a consortium around health policies which confronted the Bolsonaro administration. They developed a set of policies against COVID-19 and against the orientations of the central government. An anecdotal case, the chief of the Brazilian Federal Police ordered special operations of supervision of buses on roads in the Northeast region on the day of the election to avoid Lula's voters to get to the polls. And we had other anecdotal demonstrations of prejudice by voters of Bolsonaro against the Northeast that gained the attention of the national media. My final remarks. The main cleavage in Brazil refers to income and wealth. In terms of territorial identities, Brazil is marked by unity, but not homogeneity. The administrative design of the federation seems to be in line with this identity and with preferences for homogeneous policies. And I have this hypothesis that social policies might have stimulated an emerging political identity, creating a new axis for polarization. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rogerio, for walking us through very detailed and insightful data sets that definitely I learned a lot, and I think many of us did. Linking the two presentations is a bit difficult. I would say that what links both could be your argument at the one side, Rogerio, that you said there is a trend to more regional identities within a generally mononational country. And on the other side, Zemelak's argument that considering all the reforms and the factor of ethnicity, that the conflicts were localized. So also it created more regional identities and more localized conflicts. Obviously, the two conflicts are different in the cases we have seen from Zemelak, and you point out it's more a policy-driven, let's say, polarization. Your last hypothesis. I open up the floor for questions now. We have a bit of time, so I invite you to pose questions to the two speakers so that we can also see further insights and learn more.
My name is Katarina. Thank you for both presentations. It was very interesting. I think this is one of the most important questions discussing federalism, because federalism gives a representation and kind of respond to diversities that are concentrated in the territory, but when they are spread out, I would like you both to talk a little about that, because I think it's a huge question for countries that have immigrants and refugees, but also in Brazil with, I don't know if I agree, like I agree that we have a concentration, but we have diversity spread out in the country, a racial diversity especially, and how can we deal with that? How can governments respond to this diversity? And I think there is another question related to that, and for those that study welfare state, that is about the solidarity, and there is like a huge discussion of if the solidarity is it's it's solid with a great diversity, and like some studies show that this is not that diversity doesn't erode solidarity, but I think it's a quite important question for us that to discuss these questions in the federalism. Thank you.
So
perhaps Ayele wants to go.
Zemelak, you want to go first?
Okay, yeah, I can go first. Thank you. I think the question is, how do we deal with communities which are dispersed territorially? Am I right?
Yes, and the solidarity issue.
Yes. That is also actually a challenge here in this country, because when the federal system was designed, it assumed that every ethnic community will be found in certain defined or at least definable territorial areas. So territorial autonomy was considered as the only option or the only mechanism of dealing with diversity. But we have many communities which are dispersed throughout the country. So these communities or these members of various communities became kind of victims of the arrangement, because they don't have any political right or political representation in different regions. Now, as far as institutional arrangements are concerned, I think we can think two ways for dealing with dispersed community. The first is what is often called as referred to as the liberal approach, which basically dealing with the issue at individual level by recognizing or by constitutionally prohibiting discrimination based on identity, whether for holding political position or any other position, or in terms of being treated as a citizen in the country. So this can be one option. This would not provide any kind of political empowerment, but at least it prevents being discriminated against based on one's identity. The other option will be probably what is often referred to as non-territorial autonomy. That is an arrangement, probably, I'm sure Elizabeth knows more about this than I do. It can be an arrangement for communities which are dispersed to enjoy some kind of autonomy based on non-territorial arrangement, which allow them to decide on some of their cultural and identity issues, for example, on issues of education, on issues of language, history, culture, through non-territorial arrangement. I think these are the two institutional options that I can think at this moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zemelak. And yeah, there is an open access publication to cultural autonomy, non-territorial autonomy. I can then advise you if you're interested in.
In the case of Brazil, if I get right your question, I don't see much what federalism can do for equalizing rights and policies to regarding people that are non-white, people that are black or indigenous. Beyond what has been done. But when you mention solidarity, I would say that I'm very pessimistic. My impression is that federalism worked in Brazil despite public attitudes, despite the preferences regarding redistribution. Don't get me wrong here. In surveys, when you ask for people, to people if they want to share their wealth, the answer is clearly a no. We don't get this kind of solidarity expressed in surveys. So another hypothesis that I would raise is that elites have done the job, not because of solidarity among elites, but because they succeed in having their share in the Brazilian wealth in some sense. Of course, the asymmetries are there, but there are redistributive policies, effective redistributive policies. For instance, the FPE, the Fundo de Participação dos Estados, the State Participating Fund, the State Sharing Revenues Fund, that takes like 20% of the central government levy as IPI, the tax on industrialized products, and the income tax, and this is much. There is a lot more to equalize. And I'll go back to what Marta said yesterday, that in some terms, the political system, the Brazilian political system, is equipped to deal with this. For instance, by trusting the malapportionment of the richer areas. Marta had showed yesterday how there is a balance between the lower camera and the upper camera that in some sense guarantees that the richer countries don't have the lion's share of the votes in Congress. So I think that's it. So I don't believe that we have much solidarity, but our institutional design is working to provide some kind of equalization. Thanks.
Thank you. I still have 4 persons on. I have 5 persons on the list in the room, and I have 2 questions from the online YouTube audience. And we have approximately 10 minutes. So I introduce an innovation. If Eduardo and Rogerio do not have anything against, I introduce an innovation, and I will couple some questions so we save some time. So I'll ask Ellen and Norbert to pose the questions.
Thank you very much to both Zemelak and Rogerio for 2 very informative and engaging presentations. One big question for Zemelak and a smaller one for Rogerio. Zemelak, I mean, I've always liked this original sin argument. It's so intuitively appealing and so on, but I'm at the same time skeptical about institutional solutions to such challenging problems, as if rearranging the map could address this. And I'm thinking of other situations, say India, where they have the benefit of other cross-cutting cleavages that help to diminish the kind of monolithic nature of the ethnic conflicts. Are there such cross-cutting cleavages that would help to neutralize problems were you to redraw a map that broke up these ethnically identified constituent units? So that's the question for you. And Rogerio, I was just very quickly about administrative federalism, and I like that relationship to the public opinion, you might say, the administrative division of powers approach. Just tell me quickly, was that an original design feature of the 1988 Constitution, or is that something that's has evolved de facto over time? Thank you very much.
Can we take also Johanna? I had her on the list, and the mic is just next to her. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, Zemelak. This is Johanna speaking.
I have a very tricky question for you. Zemelak came to visit me in Berlin in November, and we had a lot of conversation about the topics he talked about today. And I remember one point that I found very interesting about Kenya, when Zemelak said that the creation of counties and the devolution of powers to counties also created important public offices in those counties. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think they're called governors. And I was just wondering whether you could elaborate a bit on this, because I think that's an important development that somehow speaks to what Rogerio presented about municipalities and states actually being less important than the national government. So here, in a way, you have a bit of a counter trend where subnational leaders become not more important, but gain importance, and by implication, reduce the importance of the national leader. Then Rogerio, I was wondering, the survey data you presented was, if I understood correctly, about the degree to which individuals wanted uniform policies across the country. Now, if you were to do this survey asking people in different states whether they supported more generous or preferred more generous or less generous social policies, do you think there would be a difference there, or would you get a similar result? So our preference is about the specific policy similar across the country, or can we see differences there? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for the very inspiring presentations. You see, federalism is power sharing, but it's also identity, and we can see that in Africa. And I worked 5 years in South Africa, another, by the way, cooperative federalism. And I was also, when Kenya was doing it, I was there. There was a question: should every county have one university? That was at that time the discussion. And of course, you see that brings some benefits if you have federal system. But the question for me is, and that also goes for Brazil. We have now a lot of metropole areas, and the question is now for me more and more: should there be something like an asymmetrical thing? What do we do with these big metropoles, Nairobi? Or I remember I was once in Nigeria. What happened with Lagos? Should it have a different status? And how can we manage it? Because there the identity is different. By the way, I think Brazil will change its identity when they become world champion in the next World Cup.
Thank you. Zemelak, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's great to hear from Alan and Johanna. Regarding Alan's question on the original sin, and the argument of the original sin is that the federal design, it is based on the assumptions that an ethnic community does not have just a single identity. There are also sub-ethnic identities, especially when it comes to Ethiopia. For example, take Amharas. Amharas speak Amharic language, of course, and they are mostly Orthodox Christians. But at the same time, there are sub-ethnic identity, and based on that identity, there has been the historic rivalry between or among Amharas of different provinces. Now, what Jonathan is arguing is, when designing the federal system, instead of just considering everyone who speaks Amharic as a mother language as Amhara, and putting everyone in just a single state, the federal system could have been designed in such a way that the system takes into consideration sub-Amhara identities. For example, there are provinces called Wollo, Gojam, Gondar. Those could have been ethnically homogeneous states in the federal system, which enjoy basically every functions and powers that the current states have, except probably seceding. So that is the argument. The overarching identity among the communities would be their ethnic identity, but the federal design, the whole idea is just to reduce the political significance or salience of ethnicity, or ethnicity being the only political factor taken as in the design of the federal system. That is the main argument of the original sin. Now, when it comes to an overarching identity at national level, the most important ones would have been religion. The most important one would have been religion, especially Orthodox Christian and Islam. People from ethnic community follow either of this religion. Now, the sad part of the story is these institutions, especially the Orthodox Christian, is facing challenges of being balkanized into ethnic, basically churches. Recently, like 5-6 months ago, there was a movement in Oromia to secede from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and establish Oromo Orthodox Synod. There was a lot of conflict. Many people died because of that. The seceding group even appointed their own bishops. People in Oromia who were against this move went out protesting, and those who were in favor of establishing Afan Oromo speaking Oromo Synod were supported by the regional government, and there was clash and many people died. Finally, the prime minister intervened, and the whole process was suspended. Now, another division has come these days. Just in the last week, the Tigray Orthodox bishops expressed their anger that Ethiopian Orthodox Church did not speak against the war in the war in Tigray. It didn't. Their protest is the church was not strongly against the war, so they decided we're not going to be part of it, and they have declared establishing a Tigray synod, not a Tigray synod, but a Tigray kind of church. And they have said they don't have anything to do with the synod in Addis Ababa. So even this overarching kind of identity are becoming now challenged because of the arrangement, because of the salience that we gave to ethnicity as the only factor of political mobilization. So even those existing overarching identities are being under pressure, and even leading to more and more division along ethnic line. Going to Johanna's question, you are absolutely right. In the past, in Kenya, the presidency was just a matter of the only political position that everyone wanted to hold, and the fight was also for the presidency, and presidential elections always were followed with inter-ethnic conflict. Especially, I'm sure you remember the 2007 conflict in Kenya, which followed presidential election in which Raila Odinga came out. He was declared to have lost the election, but evidence suggested that he was the winner. So there was a lot of violence in that country. Now, after the devolution, this governorship become very important political positions. Now, many people who were previously excluded from political participation, now they have an opening at subnational level, and governorship is coming with a lot of resource, privilege, status, and that is kind of giving many communities a sense of dignity, a sense of participating in politics, and also has reduced, not completely of course, but has reduced the importance of the presidency to some extent. So in that regard, this governorship is actually becoming a very important political position. Now, what is interesting is many people in Kenya, they first fight for the presidency. If the presidency does not work, they go for the governorship. And if it is only when the governorship does not work, or after serving 2 terms as governor of counties, now they become senators. It's kind of retirement scheme. Once you have held this important position, now you go to the Senate just to hold some kind of position. So to that extent, these subnational political positions are becoming very important in terms of ensuring political inclusion. Thank you so much.
When did we become an administrative? When did we become an administrative federation? Well, on the onset of the federation, it was rather dual during the First Republic, and then, but as part of the state building from the 1930s on, this design was developed, but it intensified strongly in a dramatic manner in the 1988 Constitution. One interesting remark is that we didn't realize that at first, Brazilian analysts, because we thought that the claim for decentralization had been successful. But then we start realizing that the power to decide was concentrated on the federal government. And I think that is a growing consensus that we are an administrative federation nowadays. Johanna, if I got your question, if we had more, if I ask people if they want more general social policies, what would they say? Well, yes, they say yes. But it's one of our challenges, and we are just finishing a questionnaire these days to start field work in August, another wave of the survey. One of our challenge is precisely to give the respondent an input that if you develop more general policies, you have to take money from other areas of the government, because in general we have what we've got until now is magical responses. We want more general policies, but we don't want more taxes nor sharing our wealth with any other poorer state. So this is a challenge regarding our survey. No, the cleavage is more among richer and poorer people, not on a territorial basis. This is amazing. We have some compositional effects because of this, because of course the Northeast has much more poorer people than the South. But when you control for this effect, you see that the cleavage is poorer against richer people. Norbert is your name, sorry. Norbert, we have another major challenge regarding metropolises, because I don't think that our current design is working. We had major problems during the pandemic to make municipalities work together. And part of the problem is the way we design this kind of potential collaboration. I'm not a specialist on this. I can't go further, especially because of the time. We're particularly pressed by the time, and we have still 2 questions. I don't have a good guess, but I can point out that our model is not working.
Thank you so much. So now the second and last round, I have Jared. Very quick answers.
Okay.
Isabel, thank you for passing the name, and then I hand to Eduardo for the online questions.
For my questions or before Isabel?
Jared is
Jared.
Isabel, and then it's you.
Okay.
Behind you, Jared.
No, maybe firstly this is on-site questions, and finally I will present these online questions. Okay, so Isabella.
Yes.
Okay, Jared and Isabella.
Okay, then really quick then, thank you so much to both of you for your presentations and the discussion so far. really quick, what did I want to ask? Well, under time pressure. So maybe to both of you, I wonder if you could say something about practices of consociationalism, if that makes sense. So are there non-territorial accommodations of diversity that have been established in the Ethiopian case, the Brazilian case, as a way of coping with diversity other than territorial means, if that makes sense? And once again, thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for both of presentations. So I think my question is more directed towards you in the Brazilian case. So some scholars argue that permissible electoral rules in the Brazilian political system sort of contribute to a hyper fragmentation of the party system. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Brazil has the largest number of effective parties in any democracy in the world. So my question is, how do you think that this high fragmentation contributes to the creation of territorial identities in this detriment sort of a national identity? And related to that, how do you think that the fragmentalization of the party system can also change the relationship between party leaders in the local level and voters, and how that also changes the responsiveness of social policies towards voters?
Okay, finally, I'm going to read these two questions received from YouTube audience. Let's see. First question, I do not know the name of the people that present this question, so if you want to present, introduce yourself, please. The first question is, how do we then build public policies that encourage overcoming territorial asymmetries and social exclusion? I do not know if this question is directed by Rogerio and Zemelak, so maybe in this case, feel free, Rogerio and Zemelak, to answer this question if you want. And the second question is, thinking that the specialists in urban planning propose to live no more than 50 minutes away from capitals in order to have welfare, between commas, in terms of good public benefits. Well, I don't know if I understood right as your question. Thinking that the specialists in urban planning propose to live no more than 50 minutes away from capitals in order to have welfare. Well, I don't know. It seems that for me it's more question dedicated to understand urban plan and federation issues, but okay, if you want to respond. There are the questions.
Yeah, I think it was kind of urban planning and welfare state and quality of life. So a bit in the same direction of how to handle metropolis and the well-being. So thank you for all the questions, and I hand over for the last short responses to the two speakers, and then we go immediately for a short break. Zemelak?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm not sure if I've understood the question from YouTube viewers, but the first question about consociationalism. Consociationalism in its strictest sense as defined by Leipart, I'm not sure if they exist in Ethiopia or anywhere in Africa, but the elements of consociationalism are visible, of course, in our constitutional design, especially the element of, for example, autonomy of ethnic communities, which is one of the defining elements of consociationalism that is provided in our constitutional design. It is also provided in our constitutional design that every ethnic community, one or the other, is represented in federal institutions. The issue of minority veto, which is one of the defining elements of consociationalism, it seems also to some extent visible in our constitutional design. For example, in our constitutional amendment process or procedure, there are provisions which have a more relaxed procedural requirement. Much of the constitution actually can be amended through that procedure. I mean, the two houses of federal parliament and some of the regions, if they give their consent for the amendment, much of the constitutional provisions can be amended. But the provisions directly impacting ethnic self-government or ethnic autonomy or ethnic self-determination, those cannot be easily amended. Actually, according to the constitution, the provision dealing with self-determination can be amended with special procedure at federal level, and every subnational unit has to agree to the amendment, which means a single state can stop the amendment process. So you can see kind of element of veto also in that arrangement. So not every element, but some of the elements of constitutionalism are clearly visible in our constitutional design. Let me stop here. Thank you, Elsa.
Very briefly, regarding how the fragmentation of the party system may relate to federalism, to be general, I think that the fragmentation adds complexity to the Brazilian system. And the way the federation is centralized contributes to minimize this complexity. What I mean is that although the whole party system is kind of opaque, when it comes to the presidential elections, we pay attention to them, and they are kind of bipartisan elections, because we always have lately we have the Workers' Party against a rival. It was PSDB and then Bolsonaro. That's it. And the second part of your question was?
It was about how this fragmentalization of the party system also leads to differences in the ties between politicians and voters in the local level.
Wow. Well, eu acho, yes, I think that it turns almost unintelligible, this link in most of the cases. That's it. To be very brief. Jared, sorry, I have Jared. Non-territorial accommodation of diversity. I'm not a specialist on this. I would have to think about. Perhaps we can take a coffee and discuss this. You see, because I really don't have a good guess, and I would like to understand better your answer, so your question. So I won't give you. Let's talk.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess cultural autonomy or non-territorial autonomy might be good to think further, especially referred also to the point Alan made initially, that often the pure territorial approach doesn't give us a solution to get out of deadlocks. But we might discuss it further in the break and bring it on as food for thought. Oh, we are generous now. So Eduardo actually, I might say also 10 minutes, then we will start in 15 minutes, okay?
I think it's better to stop now than continue because we're delayed.
So we started late. I'm sorry for that, but there were some technical issues, so we were unable, and so we finished also late with this panel. But a big applause to the speakers, and let's be back in 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
No, because you were speaking so fast. The more it gets informal, the worse. I know, yeah. It's the same. Never like yeah. Yeah, then a presentation. Yeah. This one, the first one. Yeah. Olmeda, no, the other one. Olmeda. Yes. Perfect. Yeah, excellent. I will take my. Thanks.
No, eu não sei, que o cara que falou com a gente não reconheci, ele tava de branco, não tava? Ou pelo menos com... Verdade. Ah, é só... assim, quando ele mesmo. Tudo bem, eu vou chegar no... Não. Alguém falou que você congelou. Ah, boa. Pode soltar também. Sim. Uma coisa.
Identidade. E então você acha que a mesma base ideológica seria a velha partido para quais identidades, para quais ideologias, enfim, para apelar que e você acha que é igual na esfera federal, na local, por partido, não? Completamente diferente.
Aqui, ó, shorts. Essa versão? Acho um pouquinho. Só pra ver se tá tudo certo. Isso. Eu botei o slide 10, tá? Mas aí... Ah, sim, é só encerrar. Porque tem um passador de slide, eu acredito que seja lá na mesa. É só iniciar aqui e compartilhar. Tá bom. Mas acho que é o mesmo que compartilhado, né? Pode te falar. Você precisa ficar no pendrive ou... Não, perdão. É só o que copiou. Isso, ele copiou essa troca. Fechar. Dele? Acabou, né?
Então, até agora.
Soltado?
Sí, 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 sí. Nosotros decimos que Buenos Aires, que Montevideo es como I'll be presenting, yeah. Yeah.
Do you want me to answer this question?
You can ask your question about instruments.
You better, I'll ask, I will.
Okay, guys, we have to go back. Okay, guys, we have to go back, please. I know that our coffee is very interesting, but I have to go back. We'll have to go back to work. Yes. Antonius is a big example. Please follow Antonius. Okay, we should go back right now, please. No one listen to me. What's going on?
You're the boss.
I am the boss.
Can I start? Okay, once again, good morning, everybody. I have the pleasure to coordinate this session. And without further ado, let me just hand over to Juan Olmeda for his presentation on federalism and recentralization, new trend in intergovernmental relations, which will be followed up again by a Brazilian perspective by Constantino Cronenberg. So, Juan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Rogerio. And I'd like to thank especially the organizers for this great event and for the invitation. Thanks Eduardo, Johanna, and Rogerio, or Rogelio in Spanish. And I'm gonna talk about a pattern that I see in Mexico, but it applies to other countries as well. The pattern towards recentralization. So I'm gonna talk first a little bit about what I understand by recentralization. And then I will turn to the Mexican case. I will talk mostly about Mexico, but I think the Mexican experience empirically illustrates many of the things that we have been discussing during these 2 days, especially this complex relationship between federalism, democracy, and decentralization. So I guess later on we can discuss this a little bit with more details. So I don't know if we can put the presentation here.
We need the PowerPoint activated and the
clicker.
The clicker.
No, don't worry.
Só que tem que iniciar. Qual era o Olmeda?
It's Olmeda. No.
Olmeda?
That one, yeah. Thanks. So first of all, I want to say that recentralization gained momentum during the last few years in many countries, I guess. And it was, in my view, a reaction to a previous trend that was prominent during the 80s and the 90s, the trend towards decentralization, that was particularly important in Latin American countries. And decentralization at that time came attached to many promises, I would say. So decentralization was presented as a solution for many of the problems that Latin American federal countries faced at that moment. Decentralization was presented as a way to bring decisions, policy making closer to the people, was presented as a way to make public officials more accountable, was presented as a way to promote participation at the local level, was presented as a way to make public, what happened? Okay, yeah, was presented as a way to make spending more efficient, but unfortunately, many of those promises didn't materialize. And so recentralization appeared already in the 21st century as a way to, in a sense, respond to those failed promises by decentralization. And one interesting fact is that recentralization, in my view and the view of many people working on this issue, took place both in unitary countries, but also in federal countries as diverse as Brazil, South Africa, Peru, Russia, Mexico, among others, right? So it's not, from my point of view, it's like a global phenomenon, and we need to think more about this, especially to understand the effects of this trend, of this pattern on the function of federations and the effects on democracy. Briefly, why I understand by recentralization, I follow here a definition by Kent Eaton and Tyler Dickovic, a series of changes designed to reverse prior reforms that expanded subnational autonomy and thereby limited the prerogatives of the national government. So recentralization is important when we talk especially about federal countries, because as we discussed yesterday, autonomy is a central issue in federalism, subnational autonomy in particular, and recentralization policies in a sense limit or reduce subnational autonomy, right? So it's important to understand to which extent this can affect the way in which federal countries work. Sorry. An important issue is that we can, in the same way that we can see decentralization affecting different spheres, the administrative sphere, the fiscal sphere, and the political sphere, recentralization act in the same way, right? So we see recentralization, for example, when the federal government or the central government regain power to design policies that were previously at the subnational level, or create new taxes that are not shared with subnational units, or implement some reforms that, in a sense, limited or limit the room for maneuver that subnational authorities have, right? But I guess an important point is, and I follow Eaton and Dickovic in this as well, we can differentiate what we can call explicit recentralization, and in this case we are talking about explicit or legal and institutional reforms to the framework that regulate intergovernmental distribution of responsibilities, prerogatives, and resources, right? So here we are talking about important transformations, and we can differentiate this from more subtle ways of recentralizing, right? So here we are talking about measures that affect autonomy in an indirect way. I don't know what's going on, but because this is changing without me clicking this. So I don't know. Okay, so yeah, exactly. So in this case, autonomy is affected in an indirect way. For example, if the national government implements a national program with affecting with territorial effects, we can talk there about a subtle way of recentralization, right? For example, the implementation of the Programa Bolsa Familia here in Brazil can be understood as an indirect way of recentralizing. But I think what is more important for our debates is to understand some of the assumptions that emerge from the literature on recentralization, right? The first one is what I see as a double link or a double relationship between recentralization and authoritarianism, right? So in the double link, or the first part of this link is that authoritarian governments are more prone to recentralize, and recentralization at the same time undermines democracy, right? So this is an assumption that I will discuss later on with considering the Mexican experience, but in a sense, if I will, in opposition to what, I don't know what's going on with the computer, but in opposition what we discussed yesterday, that there is kind of relationship between federalism and democracy. Here we can see an opposite relationship between recentralization and authoritarianism. The other assumption is that recentralization will be always opposed by subnational governments. I mean, governors or majors will oppose recentralizing measures because they will see that this might limit their autonomy. And finally, there is another current that underscores the relationship between recentralization and decentralization with some ideological positions, right? Especially recentralization is more linked to, let's say, a developmental approach that see the national state as a central actor in the economy and with responsibilities to provide social welfare, in opposition to a more neoliberal approach that see that it's more prone to this subsidiarity principle, right? So, having said this, I will turn to the Mexican case to see which of these assumptions really apply or not. I'm not going to talk for a long time about Mexican histories, but I just want to point out that Mexico was one of the first countries to adopt a federal constitution after the US. So the first Mexican constitution enacted a couple of years after independence included the federal model. The path to federalism was different in the case of Mexico because it's more like a holding together case. But in any case, in this first federal model, states had a lot of power. It was a very decentralized model. But this model lasted just for a couple of days, and after a while, a centralistic constitution was adopted. There is a mistake here in the date, but well, in any case, during the 19th century, the political situation in Mexico was very unstable, so the federal model was cancelled or say abandoned and later recover and later abandoned, stuff like that, until the 80s, 80s, 70s, when finally it was adopted again. And it was also included in the 1917 Constitution enacted after the Mexican Revolution, and this is the Constitution that is in place until now. However, I would say this stabilization, the stabilization or the incorporation of federalism as a central part of the Mexican model was a little bit tricky because during the most important part of the 20th century, federalism or Mexico was federal just de jure, but in practice the country functioned in a very centralistic way, especially because for almost 7 decades the country experienced an authoritarian government, or was ruling by an authoritarian government. A particular authoritarian government, a single party government with some special qualities because well, elections were held on a regular basis, governors were elected, but the presidents were elected, legislators were elected but all of them belonged to the same party, the PRE. And therefore, even when the federal model was in the constitution. The country functioned in a very centralistic way, and the president had always the final word on decided even about local issues, right? But the situation began to change during the 1980s with, I would say, two parallel currents. The first one, democratization, and the second one, decentralization, right? And those two processes went hand in hand, but they reinforce each other, right? And this was especially because the political system began to open from below, right? So opposition parties, began to compete at first at the municipal, later at the state level, and began to win elections at those levels. In 1989, for the first time, an opposition candidate was elected as a governor in the state of Baja California. And later on, other governors from the opposition won elections, even in Mexico City, the most important subnational unit in the country. And of course, these new governors began to push for decentralization until 2000, when for the first time the PRE lost the presidential elections. So as we can see here, some data about how new parties began to control governorships. And we can see here that in almost all states we had sorry, in many states the PRE lost the elections at some point. And as I said, this process took place along decentralization. Some decentralizing measures were took place before the alternation in the presidency, and we had important transformations in the administrative, the fiscal, and the political spheres. And as a result of that, governors began to be really important players, began to control more resources, began to be in charge of policies, and of course, the balance of power between subnational units and the center changed a lot. So one of the most important consequences of decentralization was that the federal transfers to the states rose dramatically because states now have more responsibilities in spending powers. And another consequence of these changes was the creation of an organization that include all governors. So the governors decided to get together to negotiate as a bloc with the national government. And as a result of that, they also were able to get some important benefits, especially in fiscal terms, right? More money, basically, more money to spend. However, I guess that one of the most important results of this process was the emergence of some unexpected consequences. Some of the issues that I think Alan mentioned in his presentation. So after a couple of years, the scenario, the Mexican political system began to be dominated by these patterns. the persistence of subnational authoritarian enclaves in some states. In most states, weak checks and balances at the subnational level. Not checks. Another important result was the appearance of heterogeneous level of state capacities, right? Some states function in a very efficient way. Some other states didn't function at all. This was especially crucial in a moment when violence, in a sense, exploded, and state capacities were more and more important to deal with these issues. We also were more aware of territorial inequalities, and in some cases, or in many cases, we also saw evidence of a state capture, right? Some interest groups were able to get access to particular state institutions and have an important say in the definition of public policy, especially in the educational area. The teachers' trade union became very active in most states, and even, I mean, I was able to decide about what states did in terms of educational policies. And so recentralization, in a sense, appeared as a response to this scenario, right? It was at some point, especially during the presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto, after the return to the presidency in 2012, the general consensus was that decentralization has failed, and instead of looking for alternatives, the general idea was that then Mexico had to recentralize again, right? So almost the option facing that scenario was that, okay, states cannot deal with these problems. They don't have enough capacities to implement public policies. They spend the money or the resources in a very inefficient way. So the solution, instead of helping them to build capacities or to control how they were spending the money, stuff like that, was to recentralize. And so, especially during the presidency of Peña Nieto, this was the result of an agreement between the most important parties in the country to together promote significant reforms in different areas. And this was known as the Pacto por México. And so we had important recentralization measures in the administrative, in the fiscal, and in the political sphere. I'm not going to talk in detail about each of them, but I would say that in the administrative area, recentralization was prominent in the education sector and in the public security sector, with the creation of a special national police, the Gendarmería Nacional. It was like a military police, and with decentralization of teachers' payroll. Right before that, the federal government transferred money to the states, and they were in charge of paying teachers. And with this reform, the federal state regained responsibility on this. And recentralization was also important in the political sphere because the creation of a national electoral institute that became responsible for electing the members of state electoral institutes, right? We can talk a little bit later about this. And also the creation of a special position. There was that presidential, in this case, was a presidential delegate to a particular state, the state of Michoacán, that was under a crisis of violence. And so this presidential delegate was in charge of, in a sense, coordinating all national programs for that state, and in fact became almost as powerful as the governor of the state. What is interesting, looking at the Mexican case, is that the president that replaced Peña Nieto, the current president López Obrador, won the election, the 2018 election, with a very critical discourse about what Peña Nieto had been doing, but with a similar view about the importance of recentralization, right? So in a sense, they were the opposite in ideological terms, but they share a common view about the failure of decentralization. And so López Obrador continue with recentralization measures, right? So in this case, with similar recentralization measures for the security sector and the education sector, and also now for the healthcare provision, with the creation of a new institute that would take charge of hospitals and clinics that were before in the hands of the states. And in a sense, he copied that idea of the super delegates. I don't know if this is a word in English, but you use it in the States. But I mean, this position now was created for every state. So now we have in every state a super delegate representing the federal government, who is in charge of coordinating all national programs. And in many states, these super delegates are as powerful as the governors. So just to finish, I think it's important. Well, I mean, this is some of the findings. Oh, sorry. Of the findings of the comparison. What is for me really interesting is this continuity in a context of change, right? I mean, as I said, both presidents had very opposite ideological views, but they share this diagnosis about the importance of recentralization. In the case of Peña Nieto, the failure of decentralization was more presented in terms of inefficiencies, right? Decentralization had led to inefficiencies. In the case of López Obrador, it's presented more in terms of corruption and regional disparities. But the solution for both of them was the same, right? Recentralize. In the case of Peña Nieto, recentralization was the result of negotiations with other political forces. In the case of López Obrador, was more the result of his own political will. An interesting point for me is that they did that even when most of the governors at both times were enrolled in the ruling party. Right? So in a sense, their co-partisans were punished by these recentralizing measures. And at the same time, governors did not oppose recentralization, especially administrative and fiscal recentralization. So in a sense, this is interesting because we think that governors want to have more responsibilities, more spending powers, but in some occasions when problems are very difficult to resolve, they prefer someone else to take the responsibility to deal with these problems. And the final issue is related to this what I call the center, right? I mean, we usually talk when we talk about decentralization, we talk about changes in the balance of power between the center and the periphery, or the center and subnational units, but we take the center as a kind of black box, right? And I think an important point that we can understand from Mexican experience is that different institutions are the center, at the center can be affected in a different way by decentralization or recentralization, right? So in the case of Peña Nieto, the ones, I mean, recentralization led to the strengthening of national autonomous bodies, that the National Electoral Institute, or the Institute for the Evaluation of the National Institute for the Evaluation of the Education. But in the case of López Obrador, the federal executive was the one who gained more from decentralization. So just to finish, I would say that recentralization appears as a new trend, and is taking place in the context of democratic regimes. We need to think a little bit more about what this might, what the effects will be or would be in terms of the functioning of these democratic regimes, especially in the Mexican case, but I think this might apply to other cases too. Recentralization was viewed as a fast solution to reverse some unexpected consequences of decentralization, and in the Mexican case was not necessarily connected to ideology. Recentralizing measures were taken by kind of technocratic center-right president and by a populist center-left president. So we need to think probably more about this and to see what is behind. But thank you very much. I will finish now.
Yes, thank you so much for this not only informative, but in many ways I think quite surprising, at least for me, maybe for some others, a presentation, and gives us a lot to talk about, but not quite yet, because we have the reaction, or the next presentation, much more the Brazilian perspective by Constantino Kornenberg. Can I, or no? Oh, I'm sorry. I have the old, I'm sorry. Okay, just a short discussion. Okay, short discussion. So, I'm sorry. Professor Daniel Vazquez? Vazquez? So this is correct? Yeah, so I will just pass on immediately the word to you, Professor Vazquez. My apologies for messing up. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Daniel Vazquez. I am associate professor at the Federal University of São Paulo. And first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to stay here with you. I think that I will be brief because some of the things that I would say about the framework of the Brazilian federalism were already very well explained by Marta and Catarina yesterday and today with Rogerio. So I will highlight some of the outputs obtained by the reforms that configure the format of Brazilian federalism and defined as defined in the federal constitutional. I analyzed in details these characteristics in my book. It's here? No? I don't know.
Oh.
Just check it's working. No, yes.
No, what?
Okay. Yes. Who is the resulting for my doctorate thesis, whose title is Local Execution Under Federal Regulation. Thus, I corroborate the diagnostic that the federal government has high capacity for coordination and enforcement of subnational governments, so that the centralized policies are offered according to guidelines defined centrally. To advance this analysis, Rogerio and I, in another paper, tried to reflect on the risks of centralization in a far-right governments like Bolsonaro. Did the Bolsonaro government play the role of coordinator of the federation? Has he used the institutional mechanisms available for this purpose? And what were the effective actions or inactions of Bolsonaro during his management? As introduction, I would to say, yes, that in Brazil, the 19th and 2000s reforms in social policies aim to improve the designs of programs and optimize the resources that were already available for municipalities through new forms of funding and federal coordination. We actually, Olmeda presentation, we can see in Brazil a high participation of union in the revenue participation, but we can see the same. We can see after constitutional during the first years of 19th, after in the second part of 19th, we can see that in the expenditures we decrease this participation because these reforms that transfers conditional for municipalities, conditional grants for municipalities. Which for selective to offer select programs which are provided locally but under guidelines set centrally in order to ensure the effective decentralization of social policies and to establish a national standard, decentralized policies with a standard national, capable of reducing inequalities in the resources available for social policies funding. I used Djokovic too. He stated that the recentralization processes promoted institutional change also through a process of laying. New worlds coexist with distribution of competence defined in the previous process. By different legal and institutional mechanisms used in accordance with the specifics of which policies the reforms promote important changes in the social policies funding. Institutional reforms improved decentralized services, increased resources available to local governments, and reduced the horizontal inequalities in the funding of education and health policies, for example. In the Brazilian case, a number of studies highlighted how PSDB, the social democracy part, and the works part in Brazil administrations efficiently explore the potential of these incentives to force cooperation. Expressions such as federal supremacy, used by Matarech, and features of centralized federalism, used by Machado and Pallotti, are mobilized to describe the kind of intergovernmental relations in Brazil. The central government concentrates authority as the male founder of policies, with the capacity to regulate and coordinate intergovernmental relations within the scope of public policies. On the other hand, the related imbalance of decision-making power has usually been framed as an inoffensive supremacy of the center or a minor side effect of a successful coordination efforts. Oh, sorry, I have to pass. Yes. However, in the fight against inequality, if the fight against inequality was on the agenda of the Cardoso's and Lula and Dilma governments, we cannot rule out that these same expedients can be used for other purpose. What would it be like if a far-right government used these same instruments of federal regulation to implement its programs? How would we evaluate if a government with a more authoritarian profile redirect resources already decentralized or conditionates transfers to offer of programs under centrally defined guidelines? In an environment of deep economic crisis like the current one in Brazil since 2015, would the federal governments be able to obtain the adhesion of subnational governments more easily? Do these answers suggest cooperation or a kind of coercion? Due to Brazilian institutional features described here, different federal administrations may be equally successful in indirectly curbing subnational autonomy if less beneficial outcomes to social policies. In consonance with the use of budgetary incentives to force cooperation, was all the more dramatic with extreme right presidents like Jair Bolsonaro, and in the context of enduring economic crisis. The slogan in the 2018 presidential campaign, More Brazil, Less Brasilia, was incorporated by idea by Paulo Guedes, who would become Minister of Economy. We also found that government's program formally presented by Bolsonaro indicates two objectives: strengthening federal coordination of subnational actions and decentralizing resources in favor of states and municipalities. Not in the paper, it's not so different than which was happening. Bolsonaro concepts of federation can be considered rudimentary, in particularly relevant from a policy design perspective. A growing consensus indicates that a lack of federative coordination characterizes the action of Bolsonaro's governments in terms of vertical relationship, as indicated by Viana and Abruzzo and others. In fact, did the Bolsonaro government give up its federal whole? Rogerio and I, used the analytical tools of the policy designs with the aim to evaluate the federal government's actions and inactions focused on the combating COVID-19 pandemic and the renovation of the Fundeb which is the education funding, education funding. Central policies in two structuring areas for the Brazilian Federation in the post-constitutional, in post-1988 period. Chosen precisely, these two policies were chosen precisely because they forced the federal government to act in face of the urgency and the relevance of these policies, which also structured a relevant part of the federative relations in recent decades. The intentionality in the sense of systematic actions aim at articulating objectives, instruments, and results in one of the marks of the expected design in the formulation of public policies. So we can have three types in a virtuous design. Example, a problem is identified, an objective for the policy is defined, instruments are selected, and the results achieve the goals precisely as expected. In the other side, in contrast, policy design is driven by strictly electoral, ideological, and conjunctural logics, which leave the achievements of the substantive results in second plan, would configure the now design. And in the middle way would be the poor design, in which instrumental rationality is usually used ineffectively, in the sense of not generating the expected results. So, in the paper, it's okay, it's a little small. We analyze in details, and I think I can share here more about the pandemic. That is less specific, more international. So, for facing, if the objective of facing the disease, Bolsonaro did not exercise national coordination. He didn't use the available instruments, like the blocks of funding, of source funding, and the commissions, the tripartite commissions. So we have a non-design in this case. And we have a program to aid states and municipalities, but it was, it can be considered a poor design because the transfers, a little part, I have here the numbers, a little part of this was really conditioned for health and social assistance, different of how Brazilian was doing, rising the conditional transfers. In the two policies areas investigate in detail, we picked up signs of what the policy design classify as non-design. Policies were proposed or developed. It found instrumental logic of policy design with no efforts to integrate means with the substantive ends outputs, and with an apparently irrational character. Available instruments were ignored despite their potential, such as the possibility of a nationally designed specific program for facing COVID-19, in line with the other initiatives already used in the funding of the SUS. Declared objectives failed to use the best available instruments, such as the adaptation of the voucher, the education part. One of the proposals of Governor Bolsonaro was to implement a voucher to private or convenient schools. And the government, in the renewal of the funding of for education, raised the federal government participation, but can't implement its proposal. Declared objectives failed to use the best available instruments, such as the dotation of voucher for private schools, after the federal executive gave up its role in proposing the PEC, the proposal of amendment for constitutional, in the renewal of Fundeb. For us, it was not only incompetence. This inaction was also part of the populist strategy adopted by Bolsonaro. The federal government chose fight against governors instead of facing the pandemic, like Martha Hetch said yesterday about the part of the negationism against the science part in Brazil. The public rhetoric, which seeks confrontation, works in dichotomous keys and involves taking the side, Bolsonaro trying to take always the side of the people in opposition to the political elites. Was evidence in the case of health, for example. In the renovation of the education funding, it is possible to argue that the fact of not being able to implement its proposals can also help the rhetoric of the boycott of the governments by the political elites. So despite the available instruments to enforce cooperation and the success of this in Brazil in the 1990s and in the Lula and Dilma governments, the federal government was not successful in this task. There was a great lack of coordination during Bolsonaro governments. Forced cooperation isn't automatic. Correct instruments must be used. It's more complex than a top-down decision. Has the power or the competence for coordination is not enough. It's necessary to know how to manage it. Finalize, we can take the case of the recent tax reform in Brazil with Lula, that we can see the resumption of the union's leadership in federative discussion and the more negotiated and less conflicting way of exercising the whole of coordination, indicates that the search for cooperation is a strong feature of the Brazilian federalism, replacing the rudimentary idea of the dual or the conflictual federalism as occurred during the unfortunate experience of the Bolsonaro government in Brazil. So that's it. Thank you.
So thank you so much as well, Daniel, for this very not only informative, intriguing presentation that in a way talks with each other, but also with some differences. So I think we have some interesting contrasts in the two cases. I have questions, but My role is to moderate yours. So I'm not as innovative as Elizabeth, so I will take your innovation and follow further with it, and from the outset bundle, so to save time. Let me go clockwise from my perspective then, please.
Hi, so my question is directed to you. Hi. Thank you both for the great talks. My question is more directed to the Mexican case, and just to give a little bit of context on why I'm asking this is because so you probably know Beatriz Magaloni and Alberto Diaz-Calleros, and they're both my advisors during the master's program. And I worked as a research assistant with them on their project on usos y costumbres, and also how that relates to increases in social policy in some municipalities in Mexico, and how that also helped some of these places to protect themselves against organized crime. Yeah. So I wanted to ask this in the context, especially of states like Oaxaca, where you have some cities where you have this sort of dual polities, and then other states, other cities where you don't. I think my question is related to, how do you understand inefficiency in this context when, for example, decentralizing was really beneficial to some of the places, or having these more traditional institutions really benefited these places to guarantee welfare and provide more security. And so how should we understand this sort of paradox between inefficiencies in decentralization, but also a lot of improvements in some of the local cases? Yeah, it's Isabella.
Okay. Yes, okay. Yes. Okay.
Hello, my name is Gabriel. I'm a master's student at the University of São Paulo. I would like to address a question that I was thinking since yesterday is about, I'm studying the intermediate level of government, so state government in Brazil, and I was thinking about this relationship of democracy and federalism. And I was thinking about the case in Brazil that some public policies, important public policies, like security, I'll give two examples: security policies and transport policies, like metro, subway lines in Brazil. They are responsibilities of this intermediate level, the state government. And well, it's a big problem in Brazil. We have, as someone said, we have big big cities with very distant people living from their job. We have an increasing problem with security in Brazil in many states. And well, my question is, well, we have this problem with corruption, maybe in decentralization, corruption, inefficiency. But I was thinking about the voter perspective, because I was thinking, do the voter knows that these responsibilities of these two aspects, like security and transport, are responsibilities from the intermediate level? But because I think that well, what I have read and I can observe is that in these aspects, the voters think that this is no, I have a security issue in my city. This is a problem of the federal government. I don't have a subway line in my city. This is problem of the Lula, or even the president is in power in the moment. So my question is, I see a gap between the people overview of responsibilities and the federalism and the problems they have in their cities, in their the quotidian. So as we are talking about federalism and democracy, my question is how, and as the panel is about recentralization, my question is, how do recentralization is related to this problem of the voter difficult to comprehend this federalist aspect? Okay.
Thanks very much. Two questions for you, Juan, if I might. First of all, maybe I was reading between the lines slightly, but there seemed to be an implication in what you were saying that this was a perception that the decentralization was not working. And I was wondering if you had a different take on that, whether Mexico wasn't ready for decentralization or wasn't the right country for decentralization, or it wasn't the right decentralization for Mexico, or there was some other interpretation, or was the perception actually the reality that really there was no way around it? And the second question is, are you or have you ever been a federal system in the true sense of the word? You being Mexico.
Okay. I am not now. Okay, do we have any more questions? Yeah, if I can then balance out and pose one to you as well, and add a question to that. If you could engage a little more your populist federalism concept, is that somewhere in between then the authoritarian and democratic variant, sort of a troubling but not as dangerous form of re-centralization? Do we experience here a sort of ad hoc, not ad hoc, a la carte, sort of re-centralization a la carte under Bolsonaro, but ineffectively and so forth? So maybe against that context, if you could engage that concept. Let's maybe stay in that then, maybe instead of the ping pong, now pong ping. So I'll give you the first and then, was that okay? Okay.
First, about the intermediate level in Brazil, I think I agree with you. For me, I can see a lake that after these reforms, Union established direct relations with the municipalities. Maybe because of the competence, the distribution of the competence. So, for example, in the Programa Bolsa Família, the cash transfer, it is a responsibility by Union to funding. It's part of the social security in Brazil. But municipalities have the competence to include people. So you pass the intermediate level. In the Fundeb, in the Fund for Education, Nursing Education, the Fundef, the first one, was about only the elementary school. There is a shared competence, state and municipal shared competences to offer the elementary school. And here, the intermediate level hold a paper to stimulate a decentralization. In Fundeb, in the Fundeb case, who cover all the basic education, we have the high school with the responsibility of the state level, the states. So we don't have clarity of the division of competence for the middle citizens. I think that the policies, the social policies that affect more the day by day of them, is the citizens see the responsibility of the municipality and union and jump the intermediate level. So maybe we can think about a system specific for public security that's mobilized more directly the intermediate level and call the attention of the public debate and the citizens in general. About the characteristic of the populist federative. When the Bolsonaro's chose to didn't exercise the role of coordinate, it's not only incompetence. He asked for the competence for the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the competency is shared. So, in this case, Bolsonaro, we custom to see in Brazil, wash his hands, and leave the decisions. Part transfer money for aid states and municipalities, but that didn't exercise the role of coordination expected for union. It can be, it was bad, of course, but thinking that in the case Bolsonaro was the president, I don't know if the results could be better, but I'm joking. But these options served as a rhetorical argumentation that would be used independently of the evolution of the pandemic in Brazil. In the case of a high number of deaths, as happened, in fact, unfortunately in Brazil, the government would point out that the social isolation was ineffective, causing the death of companies and jobs too. In the case of the low mortality, Bolsonaro would highlight the low severity of the pandemic and the unnecessary quarantine imposed by governors and mayors. In both cases, Bolsonaro would be as a populist on the side of the people, in defense of work and entrepreneurs, and against political politics that is disgusting in Brazil. So it was when he chose to wash his hands, was a position, populist position, to construct a rhetorical argumentation despite of the results of the pandemic. The pandemic. It's not like it's not with me. So in case or other, he could argumentate that I was in the correct sides, in the side of the workers and entrepreneurs. But it's because of the position, the negationist position of the federal government, how, like Marta said yesterday.
Thank you so much. And thank you. And I think maybe you can build maybe against that backdrop and your complex questions, Juan. You have the final say in this discussion.
Regarding the question by Isabella, when I was talking about inefficiencies, it's not that I share that view. I mean, I was just referring mainly to the official discourse, right? And especially in the case of Peña Nieto, the government was particularly focusing on two policy areas, education and healthcare, right? And so some of the inefficiencies that they mentioned were, for example, that since states were in charge of hiring and paying to teachers, and the local branches of the teachers union was very powerful in most states. They were hiring teachers that were not qualified, or many teachers had 2 or 3 jobs and they just work in one of them. And so they were getting extra salaries for things that they were not doing. or that some teachers had jobs in two states, two close states, and they were, in a sense, not able to do that. And in the case of the healthcare system, some of the things that were mentioned were that states were buying medicines at a higher price than the market prices. And so in both cases, the solution was, or the proposed solution was, now the federal government should take care of this. We should buy medicines centrally, so we will make savings, and the same with teachers, right? So but of course this applied to some particular sectors, right? So that was, I guess, the explanation or the focus on inefficiencies. And at that point, the Secretary of Finance was particularly concerned with that issue, and this is why that was prominent in the official response. So the second point, I don't remember your name, sorry. Gabriel. That Gabriel asked about was if people is aware of who is responsible for what, I would say, right? And I know there are some surveys, but my feeling is that few people know about this, or a few people really know about what I mean, especially if we consider states and the federal government, right? Few people are aware of who is responsible for what. For a couple of things, I would say. I mean, the first, I mean, it's not just people's fault, you know. I guess there are some structural issues that make things complicated. The first one is that, I mean, shared responsibilities, right? In most policy areas, states share responsibilities with the federal government, and it's very difficult to understand. I mean, even if legally we can understand what is in the realm of each one, in practice is very difficult, right? I mean, for example, in security, in the security area, the federal government is in charge of dealing with federal crimes, right? So, for example, drug trafficking is a federal crime, so the federal police or the Guardia Nacional now should take care of that. But and the states are responsible for prosecuting state crimes, right? But for example, cartels not only sell or traffic drugs, but they are also involved in other type of crimes, right? Extortion, who is in charge of the states. So in those cases, I mean, they need to cooperate if they want to go against a particular cartel, right? For people, it's very difficult to understand why they are. I mean, in an operation, they should get together, right, to deal with that. So that's the first thing. And the other thing is that in the Mexican political system, the president plays a very important role. So in the end of the day, in the end of the day, everyone will go and ask the president to solve their problems, right? So, and especially with this president that is very, in a sense, is very vocal and is central to the political system. So I would say that that's the case. And finally, to respond Alan's question, Well, your last question really takes me by surprise. I didn't. No, I will go first with the first question. I think the diagnosis was somehow true. I mean, in the sense that this heterogeneity in terms of state capacities was true. Corruption was rampant. Inefficiencies were also prevalent. But I think my let's say my critique to this is that I mean, first, they were not able to differentiate, right? I mean, they were not able to acknowledge this heterogeneity and the fact that, for example, some states might need I mean, were working really well, while others were working really bad. So they were not able to in a sense, acknowledge that, and they were not able to take the long road, I would say. And the long road would be to help states to build their capacities and to get better instruments to deal with these problems. So that's why I was saying that recentralization was the fast solution or the rapid solution, right? So I think that that's my critique to this approach. And regarding your final question, I would say that, yeah, Mexico is federal, it's in the Constitution. Right? So, no, well, just to finish, I would say that it's a very centralized federation, and it only really work, I would say, like a more federal country in terms of vertical division of power, right? I mean, in situations when most governors belong to a party or to parties that were in the opposition to the president. So in those occasions, I think it became more clear the federal aspect of Mexico. Yeah.
So thank you once again to both of you, to Daniel and to Juan, and to participants for some great questions that I think also bear much relevance that we can return to again in later sessions. So thank you once again. I can continue if you like and take on the next. Or Federalism in Time of Crisis. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, because I forgot. So I think now we will have this last session before having our lunch. So it's okay? Oh, Giovanni. Thank you so much, Giovanni. We are here waiting for your presentation. It's a great pleasure to receive you, even through online way, okay? Now the word is yours, and once again, thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Is the technique working fine? Can you hear me? Jared, can you give me thumbs up?
Yes, I can hear you. We can hear you.
Great, perfect. It's nice seeing all of you, those of you who I already know, and also meeting some new people. And thank you for inviting me and giving me the presentation to speak to you or with you about federalism in times of crisis, in times of emergencies. My presentation is basically about work that I have done together with a colleague who is sitting amongst you, Johanna Schnabel. And I will just share my presentation and try to give some insights that are hopefully of interest to you. I just need to see how I can now do that. So is that working fine?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect, great. So I looked at the program and I saw that you have a lot of presentations, especially this morning, that deal with decentralization, recentralization, but also I think in the first presentation, coordination was a topic. So I think that this panel on the presentations can very nicely speak to each other, and in order to try to not to duplicate too much what has already been said, I'm trying to focus on the aspect of federal coordination and federal coordination in times of crisis, especially. So let me start by saying some things that maybe you have already discussed, that a crisis creates specific challenges in federations. Of course, they create challenges in all countries that are faced with crises, but I think that federations are special for mainly two reasons. First, crises affect a broad range of people. So often we do not speak of crises when only a small group of people is affected. And when we then look at federations, these people might live in different substates, in different jurisdictions. And additionally, crises very often are not sector specific. So they have a broad range. They concern many policy areas. And again, in federations, these policy areas might be assigned to various levels of government. So when we then look at crises in federations, the challenge is how can we create consistent and equal crisis management responses in terms of policy? So how can we have consistent policy and also treat people within the federation equally so that they will equally profit from our crisis management measures? And my argument, or the argument in our research, would then be that consistent and equal crisis management in federations needs efficient federal coordination. And that is basically the point that I'm trying to make here. Before I start with the argument, I would like to first look at why coordination, right? What could be the possible benefits of coordination, but what could also be problems that countries are faced with, that governments are faced with when coordinating. When we look into the literature, we find as benefits of coordination that coordination can help to avoid negative externalities, mostly by internalizing, but it also can create positive externalities, very often in the form of economies of scale. Coordination can avoid intergovernmental conflict. It can avoid fragmentation, redundancy, contradiction, duplication of policies. It can enable learning from each other. And in the end, it can maybe or hopefully contribute to more coherence, more consistency, and more equality of policy of people within a federation. But despite all these promises, coordination also, of course, is something that needs to be done. A process needs to be established, actors need to be involved. So coordination often is associated with less efficiency, because one cannot decide on their own, but they need to coordinate with others. And also in terms of effectiveness, we find that sometimes coordination only leads to the lowest common denominator, or it can lead to gridlock and stalemate altogether, so that no decision can be taken and no steps forward can be made. And I'm sure we all know examples of these problems. But nevertheless, I would like to make the point that coordination still is important. But there, like when we look at the discourse in literature, but also in practice, it is very often unclear what coordination means. Some people, when they talk about coordination, mean that people just talk to each other, right? So they mean the process of coordination, they're coming together. Others mean, when they say coordination, that it should be like a consistent, uniform outcome of such a process. And this led us to looking at or to starting to trying to conceptualize coordination in its various steps. So we're starting this process, and I hope you can at least a little bit read what is there, but I will explain. So in the beginning, there's of course the decision of governments to coordinate, and Arthur Benz made a great contribution in listing all the aims that governments can have when they're trying to coordinate. This can be realizing an advantage, avoiding costs or creating benefits that lie outside the constitution, to tackle the unequal distribution of resources, or to deal with some sort of overlap of powers or responsibilities. And once this decision to coordinate is made, actors usually somehow meet. And this is what we call the coordination process. In intergovernmental coordination, we would say this is some kind of meeting, some kind of communication among governments. This can be formal or informal. It can serve information exchange, but it can also serve negotiations. And in the end, sometimes there is a consensus or a consensual decision, but not necessarily. At the end of this process, the actors might come together and say, okay, we have agreed on something, and write that down or communicate that in some form. And this is what we would call then the coordination output. So if at the end of a coordination process where actors come together, there is some sort of output, some sort of statement, declaration, resolution, agreement that is written down and communicated, we would say that this is then the coordination output. But this output still is some form of declaration of intent, right? For it to be then really a coordinated outcome, governments in a federation will have to implement this. And this implementation can then lead to similar actions by several governments, can lead to uniformity across the federation, can lead to coherence or consistency, but it does not necessarily have to. And then the last step would be then the impact, to assess the impact of coordination, which is then has to be measured with the aims that we established for coordination. So were the advantages realized? Were the costs or benefits internalized? Is there more equal distribution of resources, or is the use of these unequal resources more equal? Or do we have aligned a policy despite of overlapping powers and resources? And we think that it is important to distinguish between these various steps of coordination, because very often they become entangled. So people say, there has been coordination, and they mean actors have met. But in a similar situation, other people might say, no, there has not been any coordination because there's no coordination output or no coordinated outcome. So that is why we tried to make this conceptualization and try to define the different steps and different understandings. In the following, I will concentrate on the coordination process. So do actors come together to coordinate something, and on the coordination output? So what do they agree on when they are meeting? And I try to answer three questions, which are now, I now relate more to crises. Do governments coordinate during a crisis? So do they engage in the process of coordination? Then the next question, does this coordination lead to a result? So does it lead to an output? Sorry, I misspelled here, to an output. So do they agree on some kind of formal agreement? And then last, how are these two linked? How can the coordination process be organized so that it leads to a coordinated result? And so I will start with the process of coordination. So do actors coordinate when they are trying to make a decision? And generally, we argue that there are two dimensions relevant here. So I think you have already tackled these in the last presentation, as I heard from the discussion just before. So decisions in a federation can be made centralized, so the central government decides, or they can be decentralized, where the substates decide. And the second axis that we're looking at here is whether decisions are made unilaterally. So whether, for example, the federal government decides on something, implements it, and then it is policy, or whether it is coordinated, meaning that the actors on all levels of government work together. And conceptually or theoretically, even if the federal government in principle can decide on its own, it still also can decide to coordinate its actions with other actors, with the other governments. And on the other hand, if the constituent units, the sub-states, are in the power to make decisions, they can still also decide to coordinate. So in theory, who in the end will make the decision on a policy can also decide whether coordination takes place or not. And this framework now we applied to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we looked at the German-speaking countries, Austria, Switzerland, and Germany, who are, by the way, also all parliamentary democracies. So maybe there's some option for discussion and comparison with the Brazilian case later in the discussion. But we looked at those three countries, and we found a great variation here. So we found that in Switzerland, there was no coordination, at least in the first two phases of the pandemic at all. So the decisions that could have been made from the federal government were made by the federal government. Decisions that could have been made by the constituent units were made by the cantons, they are called, and they did not much coordinate and speak to each other. On the other hand, in Austria, we found a lot of centralized decision making. So as you said before, Brazil is a very centralized federation. For Austria, we can say the same, and we can also see this in their crisis reaction. In Austria, a lot of decisions were made centralized, but in some instances, the federal government decided to coordinate its actions with the sub-states, with the Länder. They are called there. In contrast, in Germany, we see the opposite picture. The law in Germany gives the power to decide on crisis, or gave the power to decide on this sort of crisis to the sub-states, to the constituent units. So they were the ones making all this, or most of the decisions, at least at the beginning. And some of these were made unilaterally without coordinating, and others were made in coordination with the other constituent units or with the central government. So what we can see here that we cannot generally say that there is coordination or that there is no coordination during a pandemic. And we also cannot say that if we have a centralized federation, there is no or more coordination. If we have decentralized federation, there is more or less coordination. We see a mixed picture, and we see that this is highly dependent on the country that we are looking at. Let me now come to the result of the coordination. So once these coordination meetings have taken place, is there an output of the coordination? So did the governments that have been meeting come to an agreement? And to measure or to better be able to capture this, we developed a 5-step scale or 4 or 5 levels of coordination. And first, we would say that a coordination process still took place even though there is no output. So this would then be level 0 coordination. So the actors met, they exchanged maybe ideas, they discussed, maybe there was a dispute or not, but in the end they couldn't agree on anything or wouldn't agree on anything. And then the coordination process is over. This is one possibility. The other possibility is that they made an agreement, and there are different levels of how specific or how binding this agreement can be. And we distinguish between the following 4 levels. Level 1 would be that the actors agree on policy objectives. So we want to go with the crisis management, want to go broadly into this and that direction. And then every government decides on their own how to get there. Level 2 would be that the actors agree on an optional list of policy instruments. So in order to tackle this problem, we could either speaking with a pandemic example, we could either do lockdowns, or we could do curfews, or we could close only restaurants, or we could close schools, or whatever. So there's an optional list of instruments, and then every government can decide which to implement. Even a higher level of coordination would be if the actors then and there decide on specific policy instruments, and often also their timing. So from Monday on, there will be a lockdown in all of the constituent units. And then the highest level of coordination output that we define is if there's a formal intergovernmental agreement, or even a model law or model regulation that is then directly implemented by all governments. And depending on the scale, we then looked at several countries and tried to assess whether during the COVID-19 pandemic, these countries achieved which level of output after or during the coordination process. For this research, we looked at Australia, Canada, Germany, and Switzerland. And here you can see that, again, there is variation across countries. In Canada and Switzerland, the level 0 coordination output, so no output at all, actors met but didn't agree on anything, is quite high. So for 64 and 70%. Then you have Australia, where about half of the meetings ended without a result, and in the other half of the meetings, various results with various degrees of coordination, levels of coordination were achieved. And then on the other hand, you have Germany, and here every formal intergovernmental meeting that we found really led to an agreement in the end, with however varying degrees of or levels of coordination. Some were very high or rather high, with like really specific policy instruments to be implemented at a specific point of time, and others were just like, okay, let's move into this direction, this is where we want to go. So then again, the question, how can we explain this variation? And we assessed four possible explanations here. And one explanation I already hinted at, and you also discussed before, is that the distribution of competences could be important here. And here we found that if the federal government or the central government is exclusively responsible, there indeed is less coordination. So if the federal government, the central government can decide on its own, it very often does so. On the other hand, if there is shared jurisdiction, more coordination can be observed. The next explanatory factor is problem pressure. And here we interestingly found that the higher the problem pressure, the likely or the higher also the levels of coordination. So when there was really like the pressure of what do we do with this virus, how can we contain it, then people really, or the governments really came together and tried to define a common approach. On the other hand, when the problem pressure decreased, coordination also decreased, and the governments took more or less their own routes. We also distinguished between types of policy, and we found that if policies are distributive or redistributive, so if it's about who gets what or who is what do we redistribute from one government to the other, there are also higher levels of coordination. On the other hand, if policy was regulatory, this was very often decided without coordination. And finally, we also looked at intergovernmental councils. And we found that in countries which have had rather weak intergovernmental councils prior to a crisis situation, we also found lower levels of coordination during the crisis. And this brings me to the last point. So how can we get from a process of coordination to an output of coordination? And here I would like to speak a little bit more about these intergovernmental councils. I'm not sure how much you have already talked about them, so I will give like a just a short explanation of what I understand when I say intergovernmental councils. So we define it as the meeting of either the heads of the governments, that would then be the peak councils, or the whole governments would be the peak councils, or individual members of government who are usually responsible for one sector, so the Department of Health or the Minister of Education. These people, and when they meet, we speak of sectoral councils. These councils can be vertical or horizontal. Vertical meaning that they include the federal government, horizontal meaning that they are only purely meetings of the constituent units, sub-state governments. According to colleagues, the aim of these intergovernmental councils can either be information exchange or coordination, but they can also be aimed at influence or autonomy protection. And so the question now is that we observe that in most or all federations, depending on your definition of federation, intergovernmental councils exist. Some of them are weak, others are strong, meaning that there are regular meetings, which usually lead to some kind of results. The question now is what role do these intergovernmental councils play during a crisis? Can they be a means to organize the coordination process and to lead to, or to increase the likelihood of results of such a coordination process? And here, for this research, we compared Germany and Switzerland. We took 2019 as the pre-crisis, pre-pandemic year, and 2020 as the pandemic or crisis year. And again, we used a similar measure of determining the output of these councils. This time we called it just bindingness. We have high bindingness or low bindingness outcomes. And then we compared Germany pre-crisis, Germany during the crisis, Switzerland pre-crisis, Switzerland during the crisis. And what you can see, and you have to look at the scale of the graphs here, which is not the same for Germany and Switzerland. You can see that in Germany, the intergovernmental councils have much more output than in Switzerland. That's the first observation. And then when we compare normal times to COVID-19, I will start with Germany. Here we see that some of the intergovernmental councils, and the first one being the Intergovernmental Council responsible for health policy, the second one for educational policy, they have much more output during the crisis. So they have been much more active, and also the bindingness of their results is much higher during the crisis than during normal times. The one that I highlighted red is the peak intergovernmental council. So in Germany, that's the meeting of the heads of government. And this council was similarly active during the crisis than pre-crisis, but the bindingness of the output was much higher during the crisis. So here in Germany, we can say that coordination was organized within these councils, and that also they played an important role in crisis coordination.
Can I give you the 5-minute warning, Yvonne?
Yeah, that's perfect. I will be finished soon. Thanks, Jared. On the right-hand side, you can see the results for Switzerland. And here you can see that the councils are nearly as active, or at least the first two ones, which is again education and health, as nearly as active during the crisis than before the crisis. Here, the bindingness does not significantly increase. And the most surprising finding for us was that in Switzerland, the peak council, so the head of the meeting of the cantonal governments, was much less active during the crisis than pre-crisis. And again, we wanted to try to explain this and wanted to understand what determines if coordination is achieved within the councils, and especially within the peak council during a crisis. And the most important distinction that we found between Germany and Switzerland is that in Germany, we have something that is called the guideline competence of the head of government. So in the German peak intergovernmental councils, the head of government of the sub-states of the constituent unit meets, and these heads have the competence the possibility to define broad guidelines of policy. So if there is a conflict between health and economics department, for example, they can say in which direction the policy of this substate should go. So the peak councils meetings were a means to not only coordinate across constituent units, but also coordinate across policy sectors. And this was not the case in Switzerland for several reasons. If you're interested, I can explain later, but for the sake of time, I will leave that explanation. What we also think could be relevant is the number of substates that need to coordinate within the council. So in Germany, it's 16, which is already much. In Switzerland, it's 26, which is much, much more. And what we also can see is that there is we think there is a difference in culture, and several colleagues are investigating this question in a research project currently. In Germany, we have this principle of equivalence of living conditions written down in the constitution. In Switzerland, we do not. And also we find instances in Switzerland where differences between the constituent units are accepted, for example, with regards to taxes. And this also could mean that maybe coordination is less asked for in Switzerland. So to sum up, I think that coordination is important during crisis if the governments want, or the people of the country want to achieve consistency and equality. But organizing this process and achieving a coordinated output is not straightforward, especially in crisis, and varies between federations. And intergovernmental councils can be used during the crisis to stimulate coordination. So I think that to like outlook, if and to what degree coordination is desired in a federation needs to be decided by each federation, or maybe the people living in there. And there's certainly a trade-off between consistency and equality on the one hand, and local adaptation and local preferences on the other hand. Also, clearly, coordination can be inefficient and ineffective, but certainly it sparks discussion about the problem understanding, possible solutions, and their feasibility. And the colleague Nathalie Benke has highlighted that this can increase the quality of decisions. And finally, coordination is demanding, of course, for political leadership to organize, but as you have been discussing before, it is also demanding for citizens to understand, which is why political communication is important, and several colleagues have highlighted this recently. So I just put you a slide for literature if you want to look up what I said. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. I thank you very much. And I'm very much looking forward to any questions or points of discussion that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I can gladly moderate this next discussion. Maybe that's in a sense better because, as you may already know, Yvonne, I'm very, very positively biased to your work. So but that was really great. And I think it also, not only was it new contribution for us here, but also builds on a lot of what we've been talking about. Also immediately to that discussion, your last point about authority attribution and the linkage to democracy and federalism. So that was really great. Thank you. Yeah, any questions off the bat? And I'll gladly, with a view to lunch, 2 or 3 questions, and I will short questions. And let me go this direction. And Rupak, please.
Thank you very much for that wonderfully detailed presentation with great data. I have a question, perhaps, and it's driven perhaps by cultural or epistemological differences. You make a distinction between information exchange and coordination. In the context in which I operate, to me, information exchange is part of coordination. Similarly, equality of outcome or agreement on uniform outcomes is one aspect of coordination. You can have meetings where you agree to disagree, and that is also an important aspect of coordination. And certainly, the context I'm thinking of here in Canada, the fact that you had vertical, you had meetings of the federal of the first ministers on a regular basis. That itself
was a very important aspect of dealing with how each jurisdiction dealt with outcomes. There was no expectation necessarily that you would reach an agreement in each case, but the fact that you were exchanging information on what people were doing was a very important aspect of. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Yes, next one.
Well, thank you, Yvonne, so much for excellent presentation. My name is Manuel. I'm studying coordination in digital government policies in Brazil. My question is, you made the difference between a decision to coordinate that was unilateral by central government versus a bottom-up decision to coordinate or more decentralized decisions. My question is, do you think there's room for a top-down decision to coordinate, but using softer instruments, not coercive instruments, but ways like creating a forum that will be a place to coordinate, to induce coordination, but the decision to create this forum or the conditions in which coordination will be taken is decided unilaterally, just by one side.
And I've got two more brief ones coming. Juan Olmeda and Norbert. And then.
Yes, Norbert Kessing from University of Münster. I mean, you mentioned the crisis, and the crisis is of course also the hour of the executive. And we have already the rally around the flag effect, but it's also the hour of the executive. So what happens to the other, for coordination, also important democracy, important institutions such parliaments? I mean, they are excluded. And I think the difference in the different countries, especially Switzerland and Germany, regarding the parliaments, is that an important factor as well?
Back to Juan.
Sorry, I'm Juan Olmeda from El Colegio de México. I have a very quick question. If you can elaborate a little bit on the effect of politics in the functioning of these intergovernmental councils, because from the Latin American perspective, it's impossible to understand coordination without looking at how partisan issues play. So I wonder if this is also an issue in countries like Germany or Switzerland.
Okay, that's a tableau of questions for you. Are you ready, Yvonne?
Yes, thank you very much. I wasn't immediately realizing that you're looking at me when you're looking at the screen. Thank you very much for these questions. I will try to make it brief. Sorry, I didn't get the name of the first speaker, but I completely agree with you that information exchange can be part of or is part of the definition of coordination. It's just that, like with this graph, I wanted to make clear that some people understand just the fact that people are coming together and talking as coordination. And in other parts of the literature, we find the definitions of coordination where only when a coordinated outcome exists, they call it coordination. So I personally think that all of what I described, the whole process, is some aspect of coordination. And our argument is that one has to be specific on what we're talking about. Are we talking just about actors coming together, exchanging information, which has a value on its own? I completely agree. Or do we speak of coordination only when there is some form of coordinated outcome or even impact, so to speak? So I fully agree with you. Then the second, Manuel, I admit I did not completely understand what you meant. So do you mean a situation in which, for example, a federal government would create a forum unilaterally, but within this forum, more open coordination is possible? Is that what you meant?
Is that more or less what you meant?
Yeah, what I meant is, do you believe there is room for a top-down decision that establishes the way in which other actors will be at the table, which to me is not the same as a bottom-up decision?
Yeah. Yeah, I believe that there is, but I also believe, and maybe later on Johanna Schnabel will say more about that, that the role that this establishing entity, and most often it will be the federal government, that the role it plays in such a forum is very important. So if it's the only agenda setter, and if it's the only one determining the participants, then I'm not sure how effective such a forum as a body of coordination can be. If, on the other hand, the federal government just gives the opportunity to meet and organizes the, let's say, the meetings and the minutes and maybe a secretariat to do all this organizational work, then I strongly believe that this could be a very, very good way of organizing such coordination. It really depends on how dominant this establishing actor would be, in my opinion. But I don't know if maybe later on you will want to discuss that further. Then the next point on parliament. Yes, so in our research, we did not focus too much on this, but I agree it's a very important point. And some colleagues are, I think, working into that direction, the role of parliaments in intergovernmental coordination. We had we were lucky, in parentheses, in the situation that like during the first phase of the pandemic, in most democratic countries that I observed, parliament was not involved in these kinds of decisions. In most countries, the executives had the power to do so. In most countries afterwards, they were held accountable by parliaments. But in the phases that we looked at, parliament didn't play much of a role. You can say that this is good or say that this is bad, and these decisions need, and how to reform that. But that is why it did not come up in my talk. For the sake of time, I won't exclude the debate here. It's just to explain why I didn't talk about that. And then finally, to Juan, that is a very important question that you're asking about politics and partisan issues in intergovernmental coordination. And Switzerland and Germany have to be answered here separately. So Switzerland is a consociational democracy where each government on each level is made up of politicians from several parties. So of course we have conflict, but also since the most important parties are represented in most of the governments, it's a different issue. And also in both countries, as compared to Brazil or the US, we have proportional voting systems. So we do not have two big parties that are facing each other, but we have also smaller or formerly smaller parties that are becoming bigger, in the case of Germany. But of course, also in Germany, we saw partisan issues arising also during the crisis, especially when the federal election was at the horizon. And there we also saw that, for example, those sub-states which were conservatively governed acted differently than those sub-states that were governed by social democrats. So yes, it was an issue, but again, in our time period, not so much. That's why I didn't cover it, but it's an important point. Thank you.
Okay, on that note, though, you give us a launching pad to not only the lunch, but also for further discussion. And so, yeah, thank you so much for your informative talk. Also the inputs from the audience and your responses, Yvonne. Thank you so much for joining us. And on that note, another little round of applause for you on the group. For announcements?
Very briefly, now you have 1 hour break for our lunch, so we'll come back to the next sessions in the afternoon, okay? So good lunch for everyone.
esqueci completamente, distraí. Vou pela lá de manhã. Aí eu falei, peraí, mas eu vou ter que sair, porque senão estou gravando. Fico vendo pela. É você. Também que alguém correu meu podcast. O conselho da Federação de Democracia caiu na ponta que já chegou e acabou.